And it was rocking that much. So you were protected.
It was howling. Yeah, it was howling.
Yeah, I'm sitting there at the house that day going, and my buddy's over here helping me out with doing some work. We're talking. He's like, "Man, gotta be tough out there." He doesn't fish much. He says, "Man, be pretty tough out there." I said, "Yeah, only idiots be out there today."
Cue me.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
We were guiding in a little tournament though, or else I probably wouldn't have been out there.
Yeah.
Don't make excuses for it. Like,
right. I was going regardless.
He was going to go anyway. That's our guy.
But I did cancel Sunday. So
yeah. Well, all right. Unless you guys have anything to add, Scott, we'll start with your sea tow adventure, your escapade. That was weird. I didn't know they did that, so that'll be good. But don't spill the beans just yet. I want to hear it. Let me see if I can find.
Yeah, I don't even know the story behind this.
Yeah, well, you will. Let's see. Where are we? Brand. Get this thing going. And
Scott, have you been fishing much or not really? I mean, it hasn't really been ideal for what you do.
No, it hasn't. Hasn't been good at all. Yeah. I've canceled way more trips than I've run.
Yeah,
I believe it.
All right, and Patrick, everything's going to be easy and fun. Just remember when I do this, I'm putting a pause into the recording so I can put the spots in later. Hold on. All right, you guys good?
Good.
All right, here we go. Love that music. Welcome into the Bite Me podcast. Going to be a fun one today. We've been talking about Captain Patrick Gardner. Patrick, your ears must have been burning the last month or so. Your name has come up on the podcast several times and decided to get you on. It works out perfect because Captain Caleb is predisposed today. So Patrick Gardner, Captain Pat, is joining us today, as is Captain Scott Null, as usual. And if you're listening to us on the recorded podcast, we post it ASAP on Wednesdays. We appreciate you joining us. Don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to join the Bite Me group page as well. We're going to get right into it, including probably our second topic here. I want to get to Scott real quick because he seemed to have an adventure that I didn't know existed early. But we'll get started on that. Three factors, the Trout Whisperer, as I've been calling Patrick, and leans on when he's targeting big trout. The great dolphin debate, that seems to be going on all the time. What depending on the weather really means, creating your own structure, all kinds of good stuff happening today. And if you're watching us on my YouTube channel, feel free to comment and add to the discussion, and maybe even ask some questions, increase the topics, etc., improve the topics, etc. But let's get started. No further ado, as they say. So Scott, I guess I don't even know. Like Patrick was telling us before we hit the record button, I don't even know what this is about. I'm not sure I do. But you said you had a good sea tow experience at your house. I mean, what's going on here? I didn't know that existed.
Yeah, you never know when you're going to need sea tow.
Including in your backyard.
Sometimes it works out that way. Well, I'm working on the house as usual, and got my buddy up here, my old police partner. Shout out to him, man. He was nails this week. He towed his little RV trailer. He's got a horse trailer, RV trailer thing. Mm-hmm. Towed it up here, hooked into my electricity, and camped out in the yard for like 4 days to help me out.
That's big time. That's
digging ditches. I mean, all
those are the friends you need,
dude. Yeah. Way better than Caleb.
Yeah, I was about to put that out there, but you beat me.
Hey.
Oh, so Caleb's going to be the target today. Okay, I'm good with that.
Caleb wanted, he wants to come, but he wants to wait until all the work's done so that he can come stay in the house.
Yeah,
but hadn't said anything at all about coming and helping digging these ditches and stuff. But anyway, I'm upping my electrical from 200 amp to 320 amp, so I can branch it off into 200. I won't get too geeky on it, but anyway, I'm upping my electricity, so I needed to pull some new cable. And Victoria Electric supplies the cable. Mm-hmm. They don't supply the manpower to put the cable in. and it's all through conduit underground. I got 160 feet from the pole to my meter.
Good. Great.
And I gotta replace that some 4/0 cable, 2 strands of 4/0 and one smaller. Pull that and put in 350M, which I didn't know what 350M was. I didn't know nothing about it, but
yeah,
it's big cable. But this cable don't bend, man. I mean, it is tough.
Like how thick? Like the size of?
Oh, I mean, I don't know.
Bottle cap?
Yeah, every bit of a bottle cap.
Yeah.
I mean, it's heavy duty. There's 2 strands of that and a strand of 4/0. 4/0's as big as I'd ever messed with before.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard. I mean, that's hard and heavy. So anyway, one of our loyal listeners, Mr. Matt Parrish, he's come out and fished with me before. We talked and found out he used to be an electrician. Now he works a medical service deal, but he's like, man, when you're doing electricity, just give me a holler, man. I'd love to come out there, dust off my tools, and get after it. Well, he got his wish, and I got him out here.
Okay, don't have to tell me twice.
That's another one, man. A great friend to have. He showed up at like 7 in the morning. He didn't leave until almost 9 o'clock that night, and so he had given me a list of things to get, and I got all of it. And he said, we're gonna need rope a little bit longer than this conduit, so we can pull it. I was all right. So I had rope that I had pulled the original, that original stuff with. I had plenty of it. And turns out somewhere along the line, I'd used some of that rope. I don't remember using that much of it, but I had like 130 feet of it and not 160 feet of it. So I tied on my anchor rope to the other end of it, and we got it all spliced together, and it's all looking good. We're doing our best, the Boy Scout impersonations, tying these knots and getting things right. And we lube it all up, and put the electrician's lube on there. And I'd rented in the little mini excavator to dig the trenches for the electricity from there to the new house and some other stuff. And we're using that to pull. I mean, what better thing to pull with, an excavator, man. So we start pulling, and the wires, Richard's, my old partner's at one end trying to feed the wire in, and me and Matt are at the other end. I'm running the excavator, and he's trying to, maneuver with the rope. And the excavator moves like 6 or 8 feet, and the wire don't go nowhere. And the worst thing in the world that could happen is to break that rope, because you break that rope, now that you got a broken in rope inside this 160 feet.
Yeah, you got to get in there.
We'd have never. I mean, we'd have had to have a 200-foot snake to get through there. So as I'm pulling on it, it's like, man, something ain't right. Well, we get to messing with it, and apparently that old rope was stretching really bad, and we messed with it 2 or 3 different ways, and it was man, I need another rope, and need better rope, need a heavier rope. If we break this, we're really screwed. So I all right, there was plenty for them to do while I was gone for an hour and a half to go to Port Lavaca. So I jumped in my truck, I'm hauling butt to Port Lavaca, go buy a rope. I mean, I don't even know if I can find it in Port Lavaca, the kind of rope I need and all that. And I'm scrambling. As I'm driving down my dirt road, hooking them that way, I went, Jeff Larson and his son Brennan, they run Ceto. What does Ceto use? Ropes. Lots and lots of big, heavy rope. So I called Larson up and I said, hey, Jeff, man, he's a retired HPD officer too. He lives right down the road from me. And they've got this new Ceto thing for the Middle Coast. And I said, man, hey, Jeff, you got any rope? He goes, is that a trick question? Yeah, I got rope. I said, well, I need some rope to pull some electric, and I need about 200 feet. And he goes, hell, we got like 600 feet in one bucket. We got, hell, call Brennan. He knows more about what we got than I do. I called his son. He says, man, I'm in Port Lavaca. I'm running errands. My dad's out of pocket, but just go by the house there at the end of the road, end of the lane road in Shoalwater, which you know where Shoalwater is. Go down Shoalwater and look in the back end of my Carolina skiff. And there's a trash can there. It's got 200 feet. That's the used rope. That's my older rope. do not go and get my brand new rope to be doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I went and grabbed that used. I mean, it is the heavy stuff, man. I mean, it's
That
heavy,
big,
heavy
thick,
duty.
yeah.
And got it, turned around, grabbed that, hauled butt back. I come pulling back up, and the Victoria Electric guys, they're just hanging out. They've turned the electricity off. They're hanging out, and they're going to turn it back on when we're done. Well, they ended up having to leave because we took it so long. But anyway, they're all hanging around there, and I'll look up at my truck, and they're like, "What'd you forget?" I said, "What do you mean? What I forget?" And he said, "You couldn't have gone to Portland and back and got the rope by it." I said, "No, I got better. I did better." And I opened it up, and it was like Sea-Tow to the rescue. And they were all laughing about having a good Sea-Tow subscription.
You should have claimed it on your insurance.
Hey, you're a big member with Sea-Tow when they'll loan you their rope to pull electric in the backyard.
Well,
I thought it was pretty damn funny that Sea-Tow came and I took care of it in the backyard. But that's my big adventure for this week.
Well, that was a good one. And shout out to Sea-Tow, and obviously,
hell yeah. I talked to him later. I said, "Man, I don't even know how much Sea-Tow is or anything about it." And he says $199 a year for Sea-Tow, and that's unlimited. That's the big membership. They'll come get you. They'll bring you gas.
And that's nothing.
They'll tow you off. I mean, it's $199 for the whole year.
Yeah.
And I asked him, I said, "Well, what would your typical tow, just your boat broke down out in the bay, what's your average
Nobody's,
cost?"
no nothing, yeah.
He said the average is $800 to $1,000 for Sea-Tow to come get you. He said it goes up from there. If you were stuck on a reef, if you were Caleb, and you were just out there stuck in the marsh with your boat parked up on the side of the marsh. Well, they're not shots when they're true, but
well, this is true.
The one where he was stuck in the marsh where he made the corner. I can't imagine how much that one
when he
cost.
didn't make the corner. You mean?
Yeah. Well,
exactly.
Yeah. Well, he kind of made the corner. He made his own corner.
Yeah.
But
he did.
Yeah, he said tows like that. He said could be up, upward to a couple $3,000. If they depending on how many boats they got to use to get you off of there and how far it is, what time it is, and all that stuff. And I got to think about it, man. What a deal. So if you're on the Middle Coast, get with Sea-Tow there, and
they deserve that shout out.
That I sent you. Yeah, I mean they saved my butt. They really did. I mean, I've got people waiting on me, and here I am with this rope that's just about to break.
And you all got laid in.
Everything got laid in there, and we finished everything up. And Richard left this morning. He stayed last night.
Yeah.
He headed out this morning. We laid sewer line, water line, and electric line. Got everything all hooked together.
That's big time. Our guy Scott says towboat in the Aransas Pass area. Use them at least 3 or 4 times a year, mostly during duck season. So definitely deserved and a good value at $199. All right, so let's get to.
Sorry, that story went a little longer than I thought it would.
No, that's cool, man. I mean, people are interested in you and what you're doing, and that's part of the community, the Bite Me community that I always brag about. But let's get to some trout talk here. This is a topic that I know a lot of our listeners are very, very interested in, and I know Scott is going to have some things to say and add to this. But I was texting with you, Pat, about getting you on. Caleb can't be here and all that, and we've talked about and bragged about you a lot lately. And I've always said you're like a trout whisperer. I mean, probably right now, especially given your age, I know some old salts, but probably the best trout fisherman that I know. And I always get the same question, and whether it's on the air, direct messages, whatever, is like how, like how. Some people just have it, but it's also something that you learn with time on the water. So I thought let's get to the nitty gritty here with you, and then we'll build on that. But the way I put it is like, you go catch trout. Let's say you're in tournaments a lot, you're with clients a lot. I was actually just talking Saturday with Mike Butler over at Anglers Anonymous. I went and delivered some more OG sauce because he was running low. So there is OG sauce now restocked at Anglers Anonymous, by the way. But and he said he went on a trip with you not too long ago, and you asked him, well, do you want to catch fish? Do you want to catch trout? Or do you want to catch big trout? And of course, he's fished a lot. So he goes, I'm going to try to catch some big trout. Lo and behold, you guys got on some nice big trout. And that's not something a lot of us can just fall out of bed and do. And I know there's more to it than that. But here's the question, if you will, because I know a lot of our listeners want to know this. What are, like, let's just put a number on it, 3 factors that you always lean on when you're targeting big trout? Because we all love them, but there's got to be like something. When people say how to you, what are those 3 things that maybe come to mind?
Yeah, the biggest thing too when chasing the big trout, you have to be okay with going out and not getting bites as well. I mean, originally starting out, like I've always been obsessed since a young age with wanting to figure out the big fish, but I had a lot of days where I didn't even have a bite that day.
Yeah.
So you have to be willing to accept when you're, chasing those larger fish that you might not get a bite that day, and you got to be okay with that when you probably could slide off to another area and get bites.
Mm-hmm.
But 3 of the biggest factors I would say is you need to look at the wind direction. Where is it coming from? What are going to be the fishable areas? Then you're going to move on to the actual water levels, which is huge for me. I look at the actuals a lot. You can go on NOAA and look at the actual water levels. You have to know how much water is on certain flats that you're going to want to fish if you know those fish are going to be up there. And then you look at the actual tidal chart. What is it doing at that time when you're going to fish? Is it falling out? Is it midway through the fall? Is it bottomed out? Is it coming into a high? And that's going to really allow you to be able to target them in certain areas. And that's a lot of, and that'll come with time too, right? The wind will also play a huge factor in what the tide's doing. It might say that the tide's falling out, but potentially it might not be falling out depending on what the wind's doing in whichever bay you're fishing. East Matagorda Bay, it could be saying that you have an incoming tide all day. Well, if you got a northwest wind at 15, 20, I can promise you it's going to be falling, So you got to be able to play all those different factors. And I'm a big proponent on fishing shallow. You can catch them deep, but when you're specifically targeting those bigger fish, getting up there shallow where they're easily feeding, looking for a big meal, they're lazy by nature. For the most part, those bigger fish are going to be up there in that shallower water.
Let's get into some of the details, because I thought you mentioned 2 things there that are very, very important. A lot of people might not. They go, oh, he said check the water level. No. You said check the actual water level in real time. Like a lot of us, and I do it. I mean, if you're just trying to go catch some fish, I'm like, okay, what's the water level doing? What's the wind doing? What's the tide doing? Those seem like very obvious things. But explain what you're talking about with the NOAA, and that's something that you can find online very easily.
Yeah, so they have stations up and down the coast that are going to show you the water level at that station at that particular time. And then it'll show what it has actually done. And if you don't even have to be fishing to pay close attention to that stuff. If you really want to learn your bay, you can watch as the wind changes directions and what it does with the tide compared to the tidal chart. So you're going to have your predicted tides for that day, and then you'll have your actual tides. So if you can pull up the NOAA and then what the predicted is for that day, and then look at the wind directions and how hard it blew and see what it's actually doing. That's how you become really, really good, is understanding your bay system and knowing what the wind direction is going to do to certain areas that you're trying to target these fish at.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I want to get into some details here, but I hope everybody catches a big trout. You got to release them anyway. So let's help them out. You said chart the tide. My simple answer when people ask me, do you prefer to fish an incoming tide or an outgoing tide? My simple direct answer is always yes. I like the tide to be moving. But more specifically to what you're doing, 25s, 28s, 30-inch trout, what are you looking at when it comes to the tide?
So it's going to be different in every bay system. So I don't mind an incoming and I don't mind a falling tide, but it's going to change where we're going to be fishing that day. And the wind will play a factor in that as well, because it's going to do certain things to that tide. If the tide's coming in really hard, I'm probably not going to be fishing a drain or anything like that on the south shoreline. If it's coming into a high, I know those fish are going to be sliding. A perfect example, 2 weeks ago, we're waiting to flat on the south shoreline. I start up super shallow just because I usually do, knowing that tide had already bottomed out and I was maybe going to catch one leaving that flat early that morning. We hit it, nothing. We slid on the secondary drop-off off the outside of that flat in about waist-deep water, and they were where they should have been. The tide was going to be slowly coming in all day long. It had already fallen out when we were in a low. So those fish had slid off, and they were right there on the edge of that secondary drop-off. Later on that day, we were rolling into a high tide around 1 o'clock. We moved a little bit further down, probably a mile down the shoreline. A lot of the structures the same part on the south shoreline over in East Bay. We just moved down a little bit, and I told my customer, great customer of mine, shout out Ken, phenomenal with the topwater, and we didn't take topwaters off the whole day. I said, I'm going to slide up there shallow. I think it's rolling into that high tide. They're going to be moving up there because there was still a lot of bait shallow. Lo and behold, I walk up there, I get about knee deep, and boom, catch one around 25, boom, catch another. And we walked into a nice little school of them, and I had to wave him down. He had to walk back about 200 yards back to me.
Hey, I'm catching them. You're supposed to be catching them.
You can kind of follow these fish if you understand if it's already completely fallen out and the tide's fallen out for that day, they're probably going to be on that secondary drop off. As that tide comes back in, they'll slide back up there with that tide and that bait to feed. You got to you got to pay close attention to it and realize, when you're catching those fish, take a mental note of what's going on. Okay, the tide's already completely fallen out and I slid out here and I caught them. Well, that's probably going to be the pattern and it'll stay true. Bearing a huge weather change, of course.
Right. And Scott, I'm not ignoring you. I just want to get, we've talked about Pat so much and the catching big trout. Want to run through some of these questions just real quick, Patrick, and then get Scott's thoughts just in general of kind of the approach, the philosophy here. How shallow is the water?
I'm going to go run a couple circuits. I'm going to go run a couple electric circuits real quick.
No, you're not. You pay attention in class, young man.
All right.
How shallow is the water you prefer? Is there a certain depth?
I'm a lot of times in that knee deep stuff, but you have to realize when those fish are going to be up there shallow feeding as well. Like I said, if that tide's completely already fallen out, they're probably going to be slid off a little bit. If you're rolling in that high tide, I'm going to stay shallow. Or if you're in a high tide and it's starting to fall, I'm still going to stay shallow. But there's really I've sight casted really big fish in, knee or shin deep water. There's not really too much of too shallow of water. If there's enough water up there for the fish to get up there, they're going to get up there if the bait that they want to be feeding on is there.
Do you find that a lot of times that you find the redfish with them, or
absolutely, and it's more so depending on where you're fishing at and the time of year, but absolutely. And that was huge this winter. We'd have to. I hate them old rubber lips. I know you, but when they're destroying $15 corkies, they'll freaking drive you nuts. And we're in areas like this winter where we were having to cull through 7 and 8 pound redfish on floaters. You know what I mean? And and knee deep water over mud, and all them redfish were in there. And my guys are like, "Man, we want to catch some trout." I'm like, "Well, the one you want is in here with them. You got to get in front of the trout."
Right?
We'd eventually catch a couple of them, but that can be a big struggle at times when those big fish are in there with those redfish because they're eating the same thing at that time of year.
Right.
So you're gonna have to cull through some of them redfish to get to those trout.
Yeah, that's what is odd to me though. I usually see that in the spring where I'm hunting redfish and I find trout.
Spring, it'll happen too. It'll happen too in the spring. I just missed this winter we fell into it a lot, but it'll definitely happen in the spring as well, especially when they're moving up shallow over grass. Those trout and reds will be all up in that grass together.
But there's a lot of times I find reds up shallow all the time. That's what I do. And there's only certain times that I find the trout up there with, around Port O'Connor. Anyway, it just doesn't seem to happen quite as often around here. I'm not really sure why.
In East Bay this year, we would have those fronts and we'd knock a lot of tide out, and these fish would be holding in certain areas over mud. So a lot of them redfish that might be further back up in there slid out. So they're really mixed in with the trout because we had really low tide. So in those times, I was fishing flats that during this time of year have way more water on them. They're probably like waist deep, and those fish aren't going to be there. But we had a 1.5 foot low tide, and everything in those back marshes was completely pulled out. So all them redfish and all them trout were sitting on those certain flats that are normally deep, but they're really shallow on the back side of those fronts, and they'll be all mixed in together. This time of year, you tend to have more higher tides, and it's pushing the trout up in where the redfish want to be. Or that's how I've mainly seen it.
Yeah. I find that the reds seem like they go just a little shallower almost throughout the entire year. If you want to get to the reds, you gotta go past the trout.
Yeah.
And they don't, see them mingle a whole lot anymore. I used to see that a whole lot more often. And in Galveston, I saw it a lot. And where I'd be pulling for, bunch of redfish, and there'd be those big, huge trout would be mixed in. And it was almost always April, May. There was a couple of grass flats in Galveston, and I'd be pulling across those and just look down and see those big black logs just laying there.
And it's happening right now. There's some places that are extremely hard to get to, and there's some really big ones in there mixed in with a ton of redfish.
Scott, I'm curious. Harrison asked the question because we always talk about structure and shell reefs and all that, and I know you've caught a million trout. It's interesting when you're shallow looking for trout. Do you actually look for changes in the bottom? And he said structure, but I'm guessing that would be changes in the bottom. More so, Galveston and now in Port O'Connor. If you had a client, that asked you, no, I want to catch big trout. I want to try to catch them. I'm willing not to. I'm willing not to catch any fish, but I want to try to catch a big trout. And you're shallow, like Patrick has been describing. Is there structure, or is it just bait driven or wind driven?
It's structure, but it's nothing you could target. That sounds kind of weird, but the last 20 years I've been on a polling platform, and I'd gained a whole different view of trout, big trout up shallow. Almost every one of them that I've seen, and I've seen tons. I'm talking in big trout. I'm talking 25 to 32, 33-inch fish have almost always been snuggled up next to something. They're hardly ever moving. They're hardly ever cruising. Every now and then I'll catch one that I see, out of my periphery just kind of cruise in, and they're just easing along. But more often than not, when I find them and I see them from up top on the platform, they are snuggled up next to the edge of where the sand and the grass meet, or they're snuggled up next to a little hump of oysters. And they're just right up against the side of it. They're always facing into the current.
A little flat, like just a subtle change in the depth.
Small stuff. And nothing things that you really wouldn't so much target. The biggest one I've seen in Port O'Connor was I was polling a place that I'd have never thought there'd be a big trout sitting there. Yeah. And I was coming out of the lagoon going into the Army cut because it was so shallow you couldn't run it that day. That one little cut, Pat, that little staked off cut that everybody screws up and goes off to the side of, and they need CETO. I was pulling out of there and just easily, I've been pulling all up in lagoon, and I was shoving down through there to get out, and tide was still falling. And as I went along there, I just glanced down, and I don't like to exaggerate, but it was well over 30. I mean, a big, big trout. Yeah. And she was just laying there up against the side of the gut, where that drop off was. And she was snuggled right up to the side of it. And she let me go like right up to her. And I mean, I could have touched her with a push pole. And then she just kind of eased off,
Why
just
didn't you touch her with a lure?
Slow.
Why did
Well,
you
it's
touch
one of
her
those.
with a little corky?
It was one of those. Oh hell, look at that! I mean,
Like,
by the
what are
time
you
I saw
doing?
her, she was damn near under the bow. You know, and
Yeah.
there's nothing I could do from there. She knew I was there by that point.
Yeah.
There wasn't no catching her. But
Yeah.
that's structure wise up on the flats. That's what I see a lot there. And I've noted, like I said, my views changed because I've been on a polling platform for so long. I get that aerial view of them, and being able to look at those trout as I'm polling along is really, really interesting. That thinking back on almost every one of them I've seen, they're laying up next to the edge of the grass. A lot of times where this might be helpful to you there, Pat, where you got grass and then you've got that little bit of mud and then you got shell. The grass never grows all the way up to the shell. That little barren point that's in between the shell and the grass, they're usually against the grass when I see them along those places. If there's no grass nearby, they're up against the shell.
Yep.
It's been pretty interesting to watch over the years. They're really, really hard to catch from the polling platform, though. I think y'all are catching them because you're wading and you're down low, and you're not.
They can feel your presence.
Yeah, you're not seeing them before you catch them most of the time. But if I can see that fish, we ain't catching it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very, very rare. It's happened a couple of times, but it's really rare to see a trout up against one of those pieces of structure and be able to cast to it and catch it. You can cast to them. They just won't eat.
Yeah.
They will absolutely just sit there. I've had several of them that sat still long enough that we made several
I'm on to you, pal. I'm on to you.
They eventually just turn. They just pivot away from you.
Yeah.
And they won't even flee. They won't do anything. They just pivot. And if you keep messing with them, then they shoot off.
Yeah.
I say shoot off. It's like a slow walk when they leave. They don't do what a redfish does. Redfish, once it feels you and sees you and all that, it just bolts. Big trout just kind of ease off. And it's almost like a waddle. It's pretty cool to watch.
And so a lot of times I am targeting structure in those shallow areas, but it's not necessarily structure that most people would consider structure. On a lot of these flats, when you come off the bank, there'll be a little bit of sand and it'll transition to mud, and then you'll come back up onto a sand flat, and you have depressions all along these flats. So you have little bowls. I'm targeting those little bowls. I'm targeting the transitions where the mud meets the sand. And during different times of year, they're going to be holding in certain areas. And if you really pay attention to your feet, say you're sliding down a mud flat, there's a little depression up in front of you and it rolls to sand to the right, pay attention to where you're catching that fish, because they're going to be doing that in different parts of the bay. So I'm absolutely fishing structure, and it can be little tiny drop-offs. I'm talking 4 to 6 inches of water difference. And then, of course, during times of the year when they're on the shell, obviously you're targeting those shell areas, which is, a structure that most people would consider a structure. But the faintest of structures, the little depressions, the little drop-offs, the transitions from sand to mud, the transitions from the mud to shell, are the things you really got to key in on. And there's micro areas within areas. So you can take an entire cove and you're like, okay, I know people have been saying they've been catching fish in this cove. Well, those big fish are going to be holding in certain areas. And it usually stays pretty true to the areas where they're going to be hanging out within that larger area. And that's up to you to really be able to pinpoint those, what we call it is the juice.
Yeah.
Where's the juice in this spot? I'm like, okay, you got 25 more yards. You got a point, that sand point that transitions to mud on each side, and you got a shell point that comes off the bank on the left side. Like that's the juice right through there. That's where the big ones are going to be hanging. And you got to find the juice within those areas, because there can be an entire cove where people are catching good fish, but if you don't know where those fish sit or how to approach those fish, you'll never catch them.
Now that's incredible, because I was just going to ask you guys. Scott and I have talked about, and Caleb, about you got to get your boots on the ground when you're fishing for a nice trout. But one thing I want to get your thoughts on, Patrick, is you obviously that bay so well, and where all these things are. Like, how does it start? For the guys that love to wade, but they haven't really thought of it in the terms that you and Scott are describing right now. Scott always talks about just get one little area, then another little area, learn those really well. How does it, what's the fourth factor for you in terms of like trying to identify those things? A lot of times the water is not cooperating. The water is a little murky and you can't make those things out.
Yeah, I will say this is a little off topic, but this is a huge way to really improve your game. So say you're trying to learn a certain area and you're walking around in it, you're zigzagging back and forth. Take a mental picture the whole time that you're wading that area. Pay attention to your feet, pay attention to the water level, where the sandbar starts, where that shell pad is within that entire cove. When you get home later that night, take a pen and paper. You don't have to be an artist or anything. Draw it out through your memory. Draw out, okay, here's where the drain comes out. It loops around this bank. You got a sand flat that comes all the way off that point that covers that cove. It rolls back in the back, and you got a deep depression that with mud in it, and you got grass lining the whole back of the cove. Somebody's probably listening like, I know what cove he's talking about.
Well, that's a good fisherman, so you got nothing to worry about.
But paint a picture, like literally draw a picture out and then say, okay, well, the wind was blowing out of the east this day. Make a note below the picture. It was blowing out of the east. Put an X where you caught those fish. Next time you fish that cove, say, okay, I had a northeast wind and I was walking this way and I caught those fish right here. Put an X. Put notes all down below that picture. And then as you're learning that cove more and more, be like, I never knew that shell pad was out there, 50 yards off the cove. Let's add that in there. Add that, little shell pad, and you can transfer all that over to your GPS. But when you can paint the picture in your head as you're walking the cove, the biggest thing too is like when you can look at the actual water level and close your eyes and be standing in that cove and knowing where the water level is, that's when you're getting somewhere. You know what I mean? When you can paint the full picture and know exactly what's going on in there is how it really ups your odds, especially when you're talking about targeting bigger fish.
And here's a tip for you youngsters, the younger guys like Pat. You have it in your head and you know it, write it down, because I can tell you right now, I've forgotten more about those places and things, because that's how we did it. We had the hotspot maps, which even prior to hotspot maps, we had even a more rudimentary map. It doesn't show all those little subtle things. It's pretty basic, and we would draw on those maps, draw out a cove, just to show somebody else. My buddy wants to go fish. I had a cove in Christmas Bay that I lived in, and I showed it to him, and I just kind of sketched it out on his map and showed him everything. I probably couldn't do that today. Here all these years later,
I'll remember.
Yeah, you think you will. You really do. You think you'll remember it. And you'll think you'll always remember it. But then years down the line, you're going, well, was that sandbar on that side of that point or that side of that point? So write it all down. That little cove right there, one of the things you were just talking about, knowing it so well. On a super low tide, I had walked out a pretty good ways, and I stubbed my toes on shell. Hard. Big chunk of shell. And I got talking to this old man that fished over in that area, and I said, man, there is a big reef right there in a weird spot. It's just, it shouldn't be a reef there. It's just not a normal place for one. And he said, oh yeah, there used to be a house there way back.
Whoa.
I said, really?
You ran into the foundation.
Yeah. It got knocked down in Carla. So, and this was the rubble and everything that was left over from this stilt house in Christmas Bay that had been knocked down in 1960s, and all the oysters had grown on it, and it was right next to a little channel. They had positioned the house by the channel so they could have a boat lane. So I had this great thing that was normally in about 5 feet of water, nothing you would wade to, but on a super low tide you could wade out to it, and it was right next to this channel that was probably 7 or 8 feet deep, and it was just this chunk of structure. It was all the old pilings and all that old junk, and nothing on the surface. You couldn't see any of it. And man, I waded out to that thing many, many times and just hammered some fish on some real low tides.
All right. I know we're going to end up bagging some of these topics because this is too good not to continue this trout discussion with Captain Scott and Captain Pat Gardner. because I want to. It's very rare that we get into the weeds like this, or grass, however you want to call it. The one thing that Scott and I have talked about over the years, even before Caleb joined the podcast, is when you're catching these big trout, like how many can you expect to be? And I call it the neighborhood, because they're not in a school. You know, they're not in a school, but it's almost like they're within sight of each other, like they're living in the country. Like when you catch a big trout and then you catch another big trout, I'm talking 25 and over, good, healthy, fat trout. Do you expect more trout there? And how would you play that, Pat?
That's a loaded one. During certain times of year, they will absolutely stack. We had a couple days in November and December where, you know, we had 15 plus fish over 6 pounds per day, which is absurd. And it only happens under certain conditions and certain water temperatures, and the wind's got to be blowing the right way. Everything's got to be right for scenarios like that. For the most part, these fish are going to be hanging out in general areas. They're not going to be schooled up. They'll kind of be spread out. They're really all up there because they're eating the same thing. So they're not going to necessarily be wadded up. But during certain times of the year, yes, you can stumble across the mother load. But for the most part, these fish are going to be, you know, spread out, stretched out across, you know, that certain area. They're not going to be necessarily wadded up. But when you start catching good fish, make sure you don't walk through them either. Slow down. And really pick the area apart, especially if you catch one, because there's probably going to be another one in the general vicinity.
Yeah, and Scott, that's what you and I have mentioned. You know, my best days for big trout, it's been you're waiting, you know, and you catch one, you're like, wow, that's awesome. You don't move for a while. You know, you got to plant your feet. You start casting all over. Then you wait a little more. And then there's another one, maybe 30 minutes later even. But there's more than one, even with the big trout. Scott, how would you describe it?
Yeah, that's pretty typical when I see them from the polling platform. And they may be 10 yards apart. They may be 50 yards apart. They may be 100 yards apart. There's no rule to it. But once you find one doing it, there's going to be some others doing the same thing. Yep. There's a reason that one fish was there. I mean, it could be a fluke. You know, they could be the one that was
passing by. Yeah.
But typically, when I start seeing, if I see a big trout, I'll start seeing more big trout. The days I don't see any, which is more often than not, you know, I don't see them.
Especially what you're doing, yeah.
You know, with what I do. But when I do see one, then I really start slowing down a little bit more on the polling platform, hoping that maybe we can spot one that hasn't spotted us yet. And very rarely that happens. But there was a flat there in Galveston where I would see them in the spring. It was almost always late April, early May. And I'd always have customers with me, and I'd be polling. And typically I'd have somebody that couldn't cast very well. And I'd start seeing those big trout, and they couldn't hit them, and they're spooking them off. If I had the day off the next day, I'd get back on that platform, and I would power pole down and then pick up and go, you know, 50 yards. Power pole down and just sit and scan.
That's my move, man. That's my move. I do that.
Really watch. And the hardest part about those when you're sight fishing them like that is just being able to see them. You know, being able to pick them out, because they don't look like a trout when they're laid up like that. It's a different kind of thing. They look like just a dark spot sometimes.
They look like logs, is what I call them.
Yeah.
Like when I'm actually up there trying to sight cast them in super shallow water, I try to explain it to my customers, like it's going to look like a big old black log. Like it looks like a dark log almost.
Yep. Mm-hmm. We saw one day with a buddy of mine. He thought it was a tire.
Yeah.
He thought this thing was huge. I mean, but it looked like a motorcycle tire or something. Yeah, that was stuck out there. Yeah, like stuck upright in the sand, and it was long and thick and black. And he had seen it. I missed it. I didn't see it right away. And as we're coming up on it, it started moving. He goes, "Holy crap, it's moving!" I said, "What's moving?" He goes, "I thought it was a tire. I thought it was part of a tire, and it just swam off." I said, "Well, that was a big trout."
Yeah. You know, and one more thing here. I just love this discussion because you know me, I always prefer trout as well. And what you guys are describing is kind of counterintuitive to what we tell people, Patrick, a lot of times about looking for the bait, the wind, the tide, barometric pressure, whatever. A lot of times we advise people to fish that. But what you guys are describing, and I'll start with you, Pat, is you're describing spots. Like you're describing the place on the map that you would fish. But I just want you to kind of elaborate on the difference between fishing conditions and bait versus fishing that spot.
Yeah, it's not even necessarily a spot thing. So I'm more so taking all those factors in that I talked about and have an idea in my head of the areas that I want to target. And then when I get there, the picture has to paint itself. The bait has to be there. The water has to look right. All those other things still are playing a huge factor in it. Like if I pull up to a flat where I want to target big fish and there's no bait, nothing happening at all, I won't fish it. So I'm not throwing any of those things out the window. The bait is still a huge thing for me. If I'm not seeing a lot of bait right now, I'm probably not going to stick around too long.
There are trout areas that will never hold a big trout.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of places that I knew I could go catch some trout. If I just needed to go catch trout, let's go hit that. It'll be easy. We can catch a bunch of trout, and I know damn good and well our chances of catching a big trout there are slim.
Yep.
Yeah.
Big trout, it's just different. I mean, you got to have a different mindset. You got to really buckle down and know what Pat knows about the area, and know how that's going to affect those big trout and whether they're going to be there or not. But there are trout areas that man, that's some great trout water right there, but there's not going to be a big one in it.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen.
And at the end of the day, you still have to be able to catch them, right?
Yeah.
You might.
That's going to be the last part of this. That's going to be.
Okay, I was going to say you might be in areas where there's really big fish, and you might not be able to catch them.
Scott, what Patrick is talking about is almost reverse engineering what we always recommend to people. Like you figure out the wind and the tides and the pressure and all that, and then you kind of reverse. It's funny because we have a question from an engineer we're going to get to in a minute. You kind of reverse engineer. Like, okay, so in these conditions, then you go through your mind, or in my case, my GPS. That means this spot might be good and this spot might be good. Rather than go to a spot first, which a lot of our listeners do because they've caught fish there, you almost reverse engineer it, right, Scott?
Exactly. I mean, and what we talk about day in, day out, I mean, we're not giving false information on any of it. That's the way you go catch a bunch of fish. And the masses want to go catch a bunch of fish. They want to go out and have some tugs. Being a trophy trout guy, big trout guy, that's when you, like Pat said, right off the front end of this whole thing, you have to be okay with not catching a fish today if you want to be a big trout guy, because you're going to be fishing areas that aren't going to hold a whole bunch of trout. You're going to be fishing micro areas that are going to hold 1, 2, maybe a dozen really big trout, and you might or might not be able to get them to eat. They may or may not be there, and you just got to have the confidence to sit there and do it and be okay with that, and be perfectly fine with, we gave it a shot today. We didn't catch one. And most guys, even ones that say they love to go catch a big trout, aren't going to do that. Lopez. It sounds really good.
Let me tell you about that big one I caught the other day again.
Yeah. Well, that sounds really good in the morning, or it sounds really good the night before the fishing trip while you're drinking. But man, we're gonna go out and we're gonna grind tomorrow. Man, we're gonna grind it out. We're gonna fish the area that's tough, and we're gonna get that one bite that that we know we can get. And about 30-45 minutes into it, this ain't as much fun as going over there on that reef over there and catching a whole bunch of 18 to 22, 23 inch fish.
That's right.
And I'll get customers all the time.
That is me sometimes. Go ahead, Pat.
I'll get customers that say they want to go target a big fish, and we're only an hour and a half into the day, and they're like, "Man, this is tough. Should we go try and find a bite?" I'm like, Well, I thought you were looking for the bite,
For the record,
and
that's
sometimes
not
you have to adjust on the fly. Like I'll get guys that say they want to go catch big trout, and then we're fishing for big trout, and I realize that maybe they don't really want to just go try and catch that fish of a lifetime, because it doesn't happen every day. You
I
got to
get the
put
same thing with
serious time in.
same thing with tarpon fishing.
Yeah.
There's so many people that say, "Man, I want to go tarpon fishing. I really want to go tarpon fishing." You just got to accept there are days when we're not even going to see a tarpon.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got you in the right areas. We're doing the right things. Conditions may be right. Everything's right, and the tarpon just aren't there. They're not cooperating that day. And I got but if you keep grinding, and sometimes it might not even happen until noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and then all of a sudden we got tarpon everywhere and we got fish on. But the number of people who can stick it out throughout the entire day riding around looking for tarpon is very small.
Yeah.
And hey, how about we go maybe troll a little bit for some kingfish, or we go catch some jacks, or we go catch some bull reds or something like that. And you got to be dedicated. If you're specifically wanting something that's difficult to attain, you gotta suck it up and take your lumps. And I've taken many of them over the years of just coming back in empty-handed. Didn't even sniff one.
You and me both, brother. More than I care to remember. Dusty asked the question, and it's going to lead to the final point on this trout discussion, which I'm just absolutely loving this today. I feel like I never get a good hook set on a big trout. And then you mentioned you were throwing nothing but topwaters, Patrick. Sorry, I still call you Patrick. But what you're throwing for big trout and when, and then I got to admit, like that's when I know I have a big trout on, excuse me, and I lose it. I'm not nearly as mad as I should be, because I knew I found them. I knew I'm on them. I just got to figure out how to keep that fish on the hook. So what went into your thinking, throwing the topwaters and keeping that hook in that fish?
So that just happens to be what they've wanted lately. They've really wanted a topwater, and I've thrown other things at them, and I keep coming back to the topwater because that's what they're wanting right now for one reason or another. I'm kind of different, and I never really even said anything about it. There's some guys down south that fish a lot that brought it up the other day about drag. We can cast so far these days. So say you're throwing a floater. I throw a floater a lot, fat boy. In order to get a good hook set, I keep a really tight drag, and I don't give them a lot of play. The longer you give that fish, the more opportunities you have to lose it. I'm more of a keep the drag really tight guy and get that fish in more so than now I will say when it gets close, if that fish is going crazy, I walk circles with it. I just let it keep going. I walk circles, like I let it just keep swimming circles around me. But I'm not one with the light drag. So he was saying it's hard for him to get a hook set. He might be going by the old rules of keeping a loose drag, finessing that fish. But I'm the opposite. We're casting so far. You're hooking a lot of those big fish really, really far out, which is another thing. When you're fishing shallow, you need to be able to cast a long way, or you're not going to be able to get a shot at these big fish. For the most, I've had scenarios where you walk right up on them and I've seen them close, you pitch to them, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, when you're fishing super shallow, you need to be able to bomb it. And if you have your drag looser and that fish eats way far out, you're not going to get a hook set very good. You'll feel that drag slide. I bury it down pretty good, and I'm going to get those hooks in there.
Scott, that also reminds me of – go ahead.
Top water, you're going to lose some fish.
Yeah.
It's just part of the game.
I think a lot of that light drag thing came from the monofilament days.
Yeah, no, it did, and people are still holding on to that.
Yep. Yeah. And fishing mono is a totally different ball game than fishing the braid that we fish now.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's true.
That's changed the entire game.
100%.
You had to have a tight drag to make the long cast and set the hook because it stretched.
Yeah.
So you tightened your drag. But as we fought those big fish, we're using 12-pound maybe 16, but most often 12, sometimes
Yeah.
14. But you backed your drag off the closer the fish got, because you didn't have
want to
that
break it off.
insurance. Because I mean, one good head shake from a 28 to 30-inch fish would snap that 12-pound. I mean, it would, just that sudden shock of a fish making a sudden move would break your line. And
Scott,
so
the other thing, go ahead.
you started backing off, as you got it closer. And by the time you got it up to you, you had it backed off so far that you had to keep your thumb on the spool.
Yeah.
Just to keep them from just a slight move, pull and drag. And then that's where everybody always says educated thumb. That was on, that's on casting. It wasn't all on casting. The educated thumb came from playing big fish up tight. You learn to, because if you screwed that up, then you get a backlash. The fish would run real hard at that last second when you had it super light, and it would be just like a casting backlash. It'd be 2 or 3 overruns, and then you're really screwed, because at that point, that fish was definitely going to break off.
Yeah. And Scott, the other thing that I know, you believe, rods have advanced so much. I'm throwing. I used to throw 12-pound trilene, man. I mean, that was it. Now I'm throwing 25 or 30 braid. I ain't worried about that as much, especially when the rod has such strength and it's so light. I want to get your thoughts on that.
So I was going to bring that up as well. I'll throw a parabolic flex rod, so it's not just all on the tip. It actually bends all the way through is what I prefer. So when I do have, I'm an aggressive hook setter. I make sure
I am aware. You're aggressive bait worker. You work the bait harder and faster than anybody I know.
I do. And so I'm getting a good hook set, and then a lot of times you can have your rod play a lot of the fight as well. So that rod will give a lot. I don't throw a stiff rod at all. I throw a decently flimsy rod, so you can play that fish more so with the rod, because you don't like y'all said, you don't have to worry about your line breaking these days. We're throwing 30-pound braid with a 25-pound fluorocarbon leader. For the most part, I'm pretty confident I'm not going to break off unless I'm over shell, which I did lose some really big fish on shell this year. But I let the rod do a lot of the playing when it comes to reeling those fish in.
All right, let's move on now. We're going to bag a couple of these topics because I really enjoyed that, and I think our listeners did as well. But we're going to move on to a couple more topics here before we get to what would Scott do and what would Patrick do. I mentioned the engineer, so I'll go to that one. I like this question because it's right in Scott's wheelhouse. What does depending on the weather mean, really? How does it decide where you fish? And here's the question. I listen to the podcast every week. You guys should be commended for helping a lot of fishermen. I'm an engineer, which I know we overthink things. That's a shot at you, Scott. I'm wondering, and if I'm overthinking this, do you guys have basic standards when the wind is too strong, the tide is too high or too low, the water is too cold or too hot? And he goes on, but I think what he's saying is, like, is there a number? If it's 30 sustained, Scott, I'm gonna start with you. Is that a no-go, or do you just kind of keep keep a pin in it and watch it? If the tide is over the dock, is that too much? If the tide is too low, is that too low? Is there such thing as the water too cold? Hey, don't blame me. This is an engineer's question, and I want to go to you first.
Yes, you're overthinking it. I mean, if you're an engineer, you're overthinking it. I can pretty much guarantee you that. I kid. Well, sort of. Yeah, there are lines, and depends on what I'm doing. Yeah, if I'm going on the beachfront tarpon fishing, I know I can still go out there. My boat's good enough. Everything's good. It's not unsafe. But I know that if the wind is getting up over about 12, 13 miles an hour, we're going to have those little bitty white caps on top of the waves. And once those little bitty white caps start forming up on top of those waves, I can't find tarpon as easy. When it below 10 or 12, 12 seems to be the magic number for some reason. 12 to 13 is when those little bitty caps start showing. And what that does is all I'm looking for out there is the flash of tarpon. I'm scouting for flashes, and I can see a flash at half a mile. when it's calm. When those little white caps start showing up, that's just closed my radius of search down to about maybe 75 yards to 100 yards tops before I can honestly say, yeah, that was tarpon or that was wave. I'm not really sure. Same thing with poling. I can pole in anything, but if it's going to get up around 15 to 20, we're poling downwind, boys. I mean, that's and so I have to change. It's not about go, no go. It's about where I'm going to go based on the height of the water. Super high tides, I know it's not going to be as good, but we can still go catch some fish if I can get into these places. Now, if it's a super high tide and there's a lot of wind, then I'm really going to be having a hard time. And I will typically tell you, hey, we can go if you want to. It's not unsafe, but we're not going to have a great day. So you might want to reschedule. And because I know I can't go in and out of the places that I need to with that much wind to get all the way to the back where I need to be. And I got to zigzag a whole lot, and I'm just not going to be able to do it with that wind. And water temperature, kind of the same thing. It depends if it's been consistent, consistently cold or consistently hot, then we can go out there and work it. It's going to be tougher, when it's at those thresholds, but we can still catch fish. When it changes hard, that first drop of that, that really cold water hit, it's going to turn them off for a couple of days. We don't typically get that with the hot water. That doesn't happen. That happens more gradually. So with the hot water, I can still go find fish. They're just not going to eat once it gets really hot in the afternoon, but we can go catch fish the first hour, 2 hours of the day, and then they're going to shut down.
Yeah.
So it's all, man, I know engineers don't like to hear that, but it's all dependent, on the overall conditions, the history of the conditions, how long has this been happening? If the wind's been blowing hard for several days, the fish settle into it. It's the day of change that is the toughest when it goes from one extreme to the other. Say it's blowing 30 and then the next morning it's dead calm, dead calm. Those fish are going to be spooky as hell. We're going to have a hard time. You just have to know what those conditions are doing to the fish and adjust your game plan according to that. You can still catch some fish. It's not going to be a spectacular day. It's not going to be the best day that you've ever had, but you can still go out and catch a few.
What about the bay fishing, Patrick? Is there a line? I know you had to bag one trip this weekend, but how would you gauge it?
Yeah, I had to bag that one. It was lightning and thundering. So I'm definitely, if it's lightning and thundering, I'm not going to be fishing. Not saying I haven't done it. I've fished just about every condition you can imagine over the last several years. You can catch them super high tide. You can catch them. I'm going way further back for the most part. If it's super cold, then you're probably not going to go wade that flat. You might be if it's been consistently cold and you're targeting a certain mud flat, but say it just dropped down to the 40s and the water temp's dropping rapidly. Can you go catch fish? Absolutely. I'm probably not going to go out into the bay. I'm going to go up the river and fish 15, 20 foot of water on the drop-offs, and you can absolutely slam in on those conditions. And so I think more so than anything in those extreme conditions, it's understanding what those fish are going to do in them. Fish got to eat, right? And I've caught them in the worst winds, and I've caught them in the coldest temperatures and, the hottest too. You got to know what those fish are going to be doing in each one of those conditions. Does it make it harder? Absolutely. So, for somebody that's just gets to go every now and then, maybe you don't want to go on some of those more extreme days if you haven't done it before. But there can always be fish caught. You might just have to adjust your game plan and understand what those fish are going to do in those certain situations.
Bag it days are dependent for me. Absolute, no-go is lightning or extreme winds.
Or 30 out of the east, have it.
Direction matters a lot in that. Like you said, east, straight east wind that's really ripping. And how sudden it's coming. If you got a front blowing in and there's that sudden change, that's when it gets dangerous because now you've worked your way over to a shoreline that's protected and everything's all cool, and you know that front's coming, you got to go back across it, to get back home. Those are the days that I'll bag it. But yeah, I do. I say it on here all the time. I cancel a ton of trips this time of year. It's not about safety. It's about I give my customers the option. I'll just tell them straight up, it's not going to be great today, boys. The polling is going to be tough. I'm not going to be able to slowly get you into an area and get you a shot at these redfish. We're going to be speed. I call it drive-by fishing. We're just going to be hauling butt down the shoreline with me poling, trying to keep the boat straight. And we may or may not have some shots. So that's why, I always say, I've canceled 2 trips this week because of the wind. It wasn't because of it was being unsafe. It was because I didn't think it was going to be very good, and I gave my customers the option of rescheduling.
By the way, Patrick, you owe Scott, I think $1.99 for saying fish got to eat. That's his copyright on that. But let's get to what would Scott do and what would Caleb do. All right, a little bit interesting. I know that's a broad word.
It's all over the place.
It is all over the place. That's exactly what I'm talking. I'm actually going down to Aransas Pass this weekend, so hopefully I'll be able to see Dean and Carrie and do some stuff down there. But man, I started looking at Thursday yesterday, and then Friday, Saturday, Sunday, different directions, different conditions, little rain mixed in. Scott, I'm going to start with you. If you had to go out, let's say you're knocking off work early, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, what are you looking at?
Hey, like today, I got 60% chance today, 0 tomorrow, 60 on Thursday, 0 on Friday, 60 on Saturday. What the hell is that? 0 on Sunday. I mean, it's like crazy amount of rain or sunshine, depending on which day you're looking at. And the winds are all over the place. I can't really get a good judge on this. I got 3 miles an hour Friday morning. I got 20 something miles an hour Friday afternoon. Man, it's so up and down.
That's not an answer, Scott.
I would not be going to the beachfront. I can tell you that. The beachfront might be cool right at daylight, but that's one of those times you could get caught out there. You get caught and it'd be rougher than hell. So if I were going to take off, I would look at Friday, early Friday, and early Saturday, and maybe Friday afternoon too. Friday afternoon's got some good, southeast wind. If you've got a spot where you can work a southeast pretty good, and you need some wind to move some water, that'd be a good time to be there. Personally, I'd be back in the back on those real super calm mornings, Friday and Saturday, and be back there poling and hunting for my redfish, because you could see at 2 miles an hour winds, I can see a redfish fart at 100 yards. So I know I can find them. Once the wind gets up in the afternoons, and it's Saturday, it's supposed to be raining Saturday afternoon. I see a little lightning emblem on there. That probably means that I'm not going to go out there at that time. So if I had to pick, I would bag it on Friday and take off work or call in sick or whatever you need to do, and hit it on Friday. Sunday, just plan on I was going to say watching football. It's not football season. Whatever you do on Sunday when you can't go fishing, because I got 25 gusting to 35 on my little handy dandy app right here.
Tell your significant other whatever you want to do, baby. Whatever you want to do. I'm
blocking
off Sunday for you.
Hey, I've got Sunday set aside to do whatever you want to do.
Just for you.
I'm going to give up fishing on Sunday just for you.
Patrick, what are you looking at?
Well, we got that front coming in. Like you said, Sunday it's showing northwest blasting. I imagine Friday morning's probably going to be a really good bite. The 2 days before the front seem to be really good right now. Saturday looks like it's going to rain a ton and the wind's swirling. But an hour ago, or maybe 2 hours ago, I looked and it said it was supposed to be blasting on Saturday. So it's changing by the day.
Maybe it'll get better. Yeah. Do the old Dean Thomas, pick the best forecast.
Yeah, right.
even if it's at a ranch in South Texas.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know if you saw that one, Pat. Me and Dean got into an
No,
argument on here.
I did. Yeah, and he's arguing with you. And
We're all looking at.
He was
our
on the
apps
ranch in
I
Cuero.
don't see that. I'm looking at my app. Scott's talking, and then Dean goes, "Doesn't look too bad Saturday." And I look at Scott, and he's got this look on his face. I'm like, "What?
What the hell he's talking about?" I ended up going down to Dean's house later that week, and he goes, "Hey man, I got to admit something." So what's that? And he goes, "I was looking at the forecast for the ranch. I was going to go bow hunting, so I pulled it up."
It happens. It happens.
He's over there south of Freer.
Yeah, that's always good weather. All right, Patrick. I know a lot of people have loved your discussion today, and always when you join us, we appreciate it. But what can they do? I don't even know if you have some open dates. What are you thinking as far as getting a hold of you?
Yeah, you can reach me on Instagram, Captain Pat Gardner, or Pat Gardner on Facebook, or give me a shout on my direct line. I don't know if I have too much. I think I'm pretty booked up till July. I might have a few open dates here and there. Give me a shout. We can try and fit you in.
All right. And Scott, we got the update on the house. Sounds like it's coming along. ScottandAllPhotography.com. We'll get you some Bite Me gear, stickers and hats and shirts and all that stuff. Love seeing him out there. And of course, go ahead and pick up some prints too. He's a terrific photographer. But am I missing anything here, Scott?
Hey man, I just slid forward to Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, take Monday off.
Is that right?
Yeah. Take Monday
tell us.
off.
Tell the class.
I mean, it's all less than 10 all day long on Monday.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and kind of overcast. That'd be some good trout fishing on Monday, I think. Yeah, that front's not going to drop the temperatures that much. It'll be 60-something degrees that morning.
Yeah,
that'd be a nice morning to be out there. 5
Yeah,
miles an hour,
right.
and it. Yeah, I think Monday.
You might have to take a day off.
Might have to take a 3-day weekend there. You know,
I'm talking about
Friday morning and Monday both look good.
Yeah. You got to take a 3-day weekend, one side or the other. Take your pick. You know, look at that forecast wherever you're going to fish, and then figure it out from there. And then on the weekend, you can take care of your wife and you do the honeydews and all that, and
get those points.
Get the points built up, and then burn that Monday,
and then burn those points on Monday. All right, guys. We really appreciate it, Patrick. As always, Captain Scott, you're the best. Good luck. As always, who is listening, watching on the YouTube channel, appreciate it. And everybody on the podcast, wherever you are across the country, appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe. Catch them up. We will talk to you next time.